Watch the activist raising his hammer toward the Virgin Mary statue. His name is Farhan. He just led two companions to vandalize this Irish Catholic shrine at 2:30 a.m. Then, brilliant white light erupts from the statue, sending his terrified companions fleeing into the night.
My name is Farhan, and on November 6th, 2023, I was a 28-year-old radical Muslim activist living in Dublin. That night, I planned what I thought would be my greatest act of service to Allah. Instead, it became the night Jesus Christ revealed himself to me. Growing up as a Muslim immigrant in Ireland wasn't easy. My family moved to Dublin when I was 12 years old, and from the very beginning, I felt like an outsider looking in. The other kids at school would stare at my mother's hijab when she came to pick me up. Teachers would mispronounce my name despite my repeated corrections. I watched my father struggle to find work, constantly being passed over for positions he was more than qualified for. The subtle discrimination was everywhere, woven into the fabric of our daily lives like an invisible thread that slowly strangled our sense of belonging. By the time I reached university, that feeling of alienation had hardened into something much darker. I started spending hours online, searching for answers to questions that burned inside me. Why did we have to constantly prove we belonged? Why were Christian symbols displayed so prominently in our supposedly secular society while our Islamic heritage was pushed to the margins? The internet became my refuge, connecting me with others who shared my growing resentment. It started innocently enough. I joined discussion forums where young Muslims talked about preserving our identity in Western societies. But gradually, these conversations took on a more aggressive tone. We began discussing the need to actively resist what we saw as Christian cultural imperialism. The Virgin Mary statues scattered throughout Ireland became symbols of everything we felt oppressed by. They represented a faith that seemed to dominate our adopted homeland, while our own beliefs were barely tolerated. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Month by month, my worldview shifted from seeking peaceful coexistence to believing that direct action was necessary. I convinced myself that these Christian monuments were not just religious symbols, but tools of oppression designed to remind immigrants like us that we would never truly belong. The anger grew inside me like a cancer, feeding on every slight, every sideways glance, every time someone asked me where I was really from. During my third year at university, I met two other young Muslims who shared my increasingly radical perspective. Ahmed worked at a local mosque and felt frustrated by what he saw as the older generation's passive acceptance of marginalization. Omar was studying engineering but spent most of his time researching what he called the historical crimes of Christianity in Ireland. Together, we formed what we called our brotherhood in faith. Though looking back, it was more about our shared anger than our shared devotion. Our meetings started in coffee shops near campus, but soon moved to Ahmed's apartment where we could speak more freely. We would spend entire evenings discussing strategy, planning what we called educational actions designed to wake up the Irish Muslim community to their oppressed status. We printed pamphlets criticizing the display of Christian symbols in public spaces. We organized small protests outside churches during major Christian holidays. Each action felt like a righteous blow against an unjust system. The Virgin Mary statue at the shrine in Rathfarnham became our obsession. Located in a quiet suburb south of Dublin, it stood in a small park-like setting where local Catholics would come to pray. To us, it represented everything wrong with Irish society. Here was a graven image, something our faith strictly forbade, displayed prominently in a public space with apparent government sanction. We spent weeks studying the area, noting the patterns of visitors, the lack of security cameras, the isolated location that made it perfect for our purposes. I convinced myself that vandalizing this statue would be a holy act. In my twisted reasoning, I believed Allah was calling me to strike a blow against idolatry, just as the Prophet had cleansed the Kaaba of its pagan statues centuries ago. I told myself that true Muslims throughout history had always stood up against the worship of false images. The fact that this particular image was revered by Christians only made the action more necessary in my mind. Our planning became increasingly detailed and obsessive. We mapped out escape routes, studied weather patterns to choose the optimal night, and gathered supplies. I purchased a heavy hammer, the kind used for demolition work. Ahmed brought spray paint in black and green, the colors of Islam. Omar researched the statue's construction to determine the best points to strike for maximum damage. We were methodical in our preparation, believing we were soldiers in a righteous cause. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so convinced of your own righteousness that you couldn't see the hatred consuming your heart? That was exactly where I found myself in the weeks leading up to November 6th. Every night, I would lie awake, visualizing the moment when my hammer would shatter that stone face, imagining the shock and outrage of the Catholic community when they discovered our message spray painted across their precious shrine. The irony wasn't lost on me that we planned our attack for a Sunday night, knowing that Monday morning worshippers would be the first to discover what we had done. I wanted maximum psychological impact, maximum disruption to their sense of security and dominance. In my mind, this wasn't vandalism, but a form of spiritual warfare, a necessary confrontation between truth and falsehood. Looking back now, I can see how completely I had deceived myself. I had taken legitimate feelings of displacement and alienation and allowed them to transform into something monstrous. Instead of seeking understanding or working for genuine dialogue between our communities, I had chosen the path of destruction and hatred. I thought I was serving God, but I was actually serving my own wounded pride and unchecked anger. The night before our planned action, I performed my evening prayers with what I believed was exceptional devotion. I asked Allah to bless our mission and to give me strength to strike the blow against idolatry that I was convinced He desired. I had no idea that within 24 hours, my entire understanding of God, faith, and truth would be completely transformed by an encounter I never could have imagined possible. November 6th arrived with an overcast sky that seemed to mirror my dark intentions. I had barely slept the night before, my mind racing through every detail of our plan. Ahmed picked me up at 1:30 a.m. in his beat-up Honda Civic, the back seat already loaded with our supplies. Omar was waiting in the passenger seat, nervously checking his phone for the weather forecast. The rain that had been threatening all day had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the streetlights. The drive to Rathfarnham took 25 minutes through the empty Dublin streets. None of us spoke much during the journey, each lost in our own thoughts about what we were about to do. I clutched the hammer in my lap, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. This wasn't some abstract plan anymore. In less than an hour, I would either be a hero to our cause or a criminal running from the police. The distinction had ceased to matter to me weeks ago. Ahmed parked 3 blocks away from the shrine, just as we had rehearsed. We walked through the quiet residential neighborhood, our footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. Every house was dark, except for the occasional porch light or the blue glow of a television in an upstairs window. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that 3 young Muslims were about to shatter their peaceful world with an act of what we believed was righteous defiance. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as we approached the shrine grounds. The Virgin Mary statue stood exactly where it had during our reconnaissance visits, illuminated by a single spotlight that cast long shadows across the small courtyard. She looked serene and untouchable, her stone hands clasped in prayer, her eyes gazing downward with what Catholics called maternal compassion. To me, she represented everything I had come to despise about the Christian dominance of Irish culture. We had assigned specific roles during our planning sessions. Omar would keep watch at the main entrance to the shrine grounds, ready to signal if anyone approached. Ahmed would handle the spray painting, covering the base of the statue and surrounding walls with our prepared messages in both English and Arabic. My job was the most important and the most dangerous. I would use the hammer to deface the statue itself, striking at the face and hands to inflict maximum symbolic damage. The shrine grounds were surrounded by a low stone wall that we could easily climb over. The main gate was locked, but we had expected that. One by one, we scaled the wall and dropped into the courtyard, our soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the wet grass. The spotlight seemed much brighter from inside the grounds, making me feel exposed and vulnerable despite the late hour and deserted location. Omar took his position near the entrance while Ahmed began unpacking the spray paint cans. I approached the statue slowly, hammer gripped tightly in my right hand. Up close, the Virgin Mary seemed larger than I had remembered from our previous visits. The craftsmanship was remarkable, every fold of her robes carved with meticulous detail. Every feature of her face rendered with loving precision by some long-dead sculptor who had poured his faith into stone. For just a moment I hesitated, standing there in the circle of artificial light. Looking up at this representation of motherhood and devotion, I felt a flicker of something that might have been doubt. But I pushed the feeling down, reminding myself of all the reasons we were here, all the injustices we were striking back against, all the years of feeling like unwelcome strangers in our adopted home. Ahmed had begun his work, the hissing sound of spray paint cutting through the night air. I watched him cover the base of the statue with our carefully planned message, "No gods but Allah," in both English and Arabic script. The black paint stood out starkly against the pale stone, a declaration that could not be ignored or misunderstood. This was our line in the sand, our refusal to remain silent any longer. I raised the hammer above my head, aiming for the statue's face. In my mind, this moment represented the triumph of monotheism over idolatry, the victory of truth over superstition, the righteous anger of the oppressed striking back against their oppressors. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in my imagination, always seeing myself as a warrior for Allah, following in the footsteps of the Prophet who had cleansed the Kaaba of its pagan idols. Now ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so wrong about something that it nearly destroyed you? Because that was exactly where I stood in that moment, hammer raised high, absolutely convinced of my righteousness, while preparing to commit an act that would have damned my soul if divine intervention hadn't stopped me. The weight of the hammer felt significant in my hands, solid and purposeful. Ahmed continued his spray painting, moving systematically around the base of the statue and onto the surrounding walls. Omar remained at his post, occasionally glancing back at us, but mostly watching the street for any signs of approaching cars or late-night pedestrians. Everything was going according to our plan. I thought about my parents sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that their son was about to become either a hero or a criminal, depending on your perspective. I thought about the Catholic families who would discover our handiwork in the morning, the shock and outrage they would feel seeing their sacred space violated. Part of me relished the idea of their discomfort, their sudden awareness that not everyone in Ireland shared their faith or respected their symbols. The moment had arrived. No more planning, no more hesitation, no more doubt. I pulled the hammer back further, putting my full strength behind the blow that would shatter the Virgin's stone face and announce to Dublin's Catholic community that their dominance was no longer unquestioned. I took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to Allah for strength and guidance, and began to bring the hammer down with all the force I could muster. That was the exact moment when everything changed forever. The hammer was halfway through its downward arc when the light erupted around me. I use the word erupted because there's no other way to describe what happened. This wasn't the gradual brightening of dawn or the sudden flash of lightning. This was pure, brilliant white light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, flooding the shrine grounds with an intensity that should have blinded me, but somehow didn't. The light appeared to be emanating from the base of the Virgin Mary statue itself, rising upward like a column of liquid fire that had no heat. My first instinct was to shield my eyes, but I found I couldn't look away. The light was so pure, so clean, that it seemed to penetrate not just my vision, but my very soul. Every shadow in the courtyard was banished, every corner illuminated with this supernatural radiance that made the artificial spotlight seem like a dying candle. Ahmed's scream pierced the night air behind me. I heard the clatter of spray paint cans hitting the stone pavement as he stumbled backward, his voice cracking with terror. Omar was shouting something in Arabic from his position near the entrance, but his words were lost in the overwhelming presence of whatever was happening around that statue. The light seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat, growing brighter with each beat until I was certain it would consume everything. My hammer felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The downward momentum that had seemed so unstoppable just seconds before ground to a halt as every muscle in my arm began to shake uncontrollably. I watched in fascination and terror as my fingers lost their grip. The tool that was meant to be my weapon of righteous destruction slipping from my trembling hand and clattering onto the wet stone at my feet. The sound of Ahmed's footsteps, splashing through puddles, told me he was running, abandoning our mission and our brotherhood in his panic. Omar's shouts were growing more distant, which meant he too was fleeing toward the street and the safety of Ahmed's car. But I couldn't move. My legs had turned to water, and I found myself sinking slowly to my knees on the cold, wet stones of the shrine courtyard. That's when I felt it. The presence. Not just light, but something infinitely more powerful moving within that radiance. If you've ever stood at the edge of the ocean during a storm, you might understand a fraction of what I experienced. The sense of something vast and ancient and completely beyond human comprehension reaching out to touch your very essence. But this wasn't the impersonal force of nature. This presence was personal, intimate, knowing. The warmth came next, starting in my chest and spreading outward through every nerve and fiber of my being. This wasn't the warmth of a fire or the sun, but something that seemed to heal parts of me I didn't even know were broken. 28 years of anger, resentment, and hatred began to melt away like ice in spring sunshine. The rage that had consumed my thoughts for months, the bitterness that had poisoned every relationship in my life, simply dissolved in the face of this overwhelming love. Love. That's the only word I can use, though it feels completely inadequate. What flooded through me in that moment was love so pure, so unconditional, so complete, that it made every other emotion I had ever experienced seem like a pale shadow. This wasn't the love of family or friends or even romantic love. This was the love of the Creator for His creation, perfect and eternal and utterly transforming. Tears began streaming down my face, though I couldn't tell you when I had started crying. They felt warm against my cold cheeks, washing away not just the salt of my anger, but somehow cleansing my very soul. I had come to this place as a warrior for what I believed was truth, filled with righteous indignation and holy purpose. But kneeling there in that supernatural light, I realized with crystal clarity that I had been completely, utterly wrong about everything. The light began to speak to me, not with words that my ears could hear, but with a voice that resonated directly in my heart and mind. It told me things about myself that no one else knew, secrets I had never shared with another human being. It knew about the loneliness that had driven me to seek belonging in radical groups. It knew about the fear that had twisted my faith into something ugly and destructive. It knew about the pain I had caused others in my misguided quest for righteousness. But more than my failures, it knew my potential. In that moment of divine revelation, I saw myself not as the angry young man I had become, but as the person God had always intended me to be. The light showed me glimpses of a future where my passion for truth could be channeled toward healing rather than destruction, where my desire to serve God could manifest as love rather than hatred. I understood, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that I was encountering Jesus Christ. Not the weak, defeated figure I had been taught to dismiss, but the living Son of God, whose love was so powerful it could transform even a heart as hardened as mine had become. The very name I had blasphemed countless times was now the only word that mattered, the only truth that could save me from the darkness I had chosen. The Virgin Mary statue stood unchanged before me, her stone features exactly as they had been moments before. But everything else was different. The world itself seemed transformed, as if I was seeing creation with new eyes for the first time. The colors were more vivid, the air tasted sweeter, and most incredibly, the weight of hatred that had burdened my shoulders for years was simply gone. In that light, I somehow knew that Jesus was real, that he was God, and that he had been waiting for this moment my entire life. The hammer at my feet, which minutes before had been a weapon of destruction, now looked like what it truly was, a pathetic tool wielded by a confused and angry young man who had mistaken his own pain for divine calling. The supernatural radiance began to fade gradually, not disappearing, but seeming to withdraw into the statue itself, leaving me kneeling on the wet stones in the gentle glow of the ordinary spotlight. But the warmth in my chest remained, and the peace that had flooded my soul showed no signs of leaving. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. I remained on my knees for what felt like hours, though time seemed to have lost all meaning in the aftermath of that divine encounter. The ordinary sounds of the Dublin night gradually returned to my awareness. Distant traffic on the main road, the rustle of wind through trees, the occasional bark of a dog in one of the nearby houses. But these familiar sounds felt foreign now, as if I was hearing them through completely different ears. My tears had not stopped flowing, but their character had changed completely. What began as tears of shock and fear had transformed into something deeper, more cleansing. These were tears of recognition, of a soul finally understanding its true condition after years of self-deception. Every drop that fell onto the cold stone seemed to wash away another layer of the anger and hatred that had defined me for so long. The spray paint that Ahmed had applied to the base of the statue remained exactly where he had left it before fleeing in terror. Our Arabic script declaring that there was no God but Allah looked crude and childish now, a pathetic attempt to impose our limited understanding on something infinitely greater than we had imagined. I stared at those black letters and felt ashamed, not just of the vandalism itself, but of the arrogance that had convinced me I was serving God by destroying this place of prayer. As the hours passed, I began to pray, but not the formal prayers I had recited 5 times a day since childhood. This was something entirely new, a conversation with the presence I had encountered in that supernatural light. I found myself speaking aloud to Jesus, a name that had been forbidden on my lips for 28 years, testing how it felt to acknowledge him not as a false prophet, but as my Lord and Savior. The transformation happening inside me was so radical that I wondered if I was losing my mind. How could 28 years of deeply held beliefs simply evaporate in a single moment? How could everything I had been taught about God, faith, and truth be turned completely upside down by an encounter I still couldn't fully comprehend? Yet the peace flooding my heart was more real than anything I had ever experienced, more solid than the stone I knelt upon. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky with subtle shades of pink and gold that I noticed with an artist's appreciation I had never possessed before. It was as if the divine encounter had awakened senses I didn't know I had, opening my eyes to beauty that had always been there, but which I had been too blinded by rage to see. The Virgin Mary statue, which just hours ago had represented everything I despised, now seemed to glow with a gentle dignity that spoke of centuries of faithful prayer. I heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path that led from the street to the shrine grounds. My first instinct was to run, to flee, before whoever was coming could discover me kneeling beside the evidence of our attempted vandalism. But something kept me rooted in place, a certainty that this encounter, too, was part of whatever divine plan had brought me to this moment. The man who appeared at the entrance to the courtyard was elderly, probably in his 70s, wearing the black clerical clothing of a Catholic priest. He carried a small prayer book in one hand and what appeared to be fresh flowers for the shrine in the other. When he saw me kneeling beside the defaced statue, his steps slowed, but he did not retreat. There was something in his weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent ministering to broken souls, a gentleness that immediately put me at ease despite my vulnerable position. Father Murphy, as I would later learn his name, approached slowly and stood beside me for several minutes without speaking. He studied the spray-painted messages, the abandoned hammer lying on the wet stones, and my tear-streaked face with the kind of patient wisdom that only comes from decades of dealing with human pain and folly. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an Irish accent softened by age and compassion. "Son," he said quietly, "what happened to you tonight?" Those 6 simple words opened a floodgate inside me that I hadn't known existed. The entire story poured out of me in a rush of confession that left me breathless. I told him about my radicalization, about the months of planning this act of vandalism, about the hatred that had consumed my heart. But more importantly, I told him about the light, about the presence I had encountered, about the complete transformation I felt taking place inside my very soul. Father Murphy listened without interruption, his kind eyes never showing the judgment or condemnation I had expected. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the defaced statue to my face and back again. I waited for him to call the police, to demand that I leave his sacred space, to condemn me for the sacrilege I had attempted to commit. Instead, he asked me a question that changed everything. "Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God?" The answer came from someplace deeper than my rational mind, deeper than my Islamic upbringing, deeper than 28 years of conditioning that had taught me this was the ultimate blasphemy. "Yes," I whispered. And in speaking that single word aloud, I felt the last chains of my old life falling away forever. Father Murphy smiled then, an expression of such pure joy that it reminded me of the supernatural light I had encountered hours earlier. "Then you are my brother in Christ," he said simply, "and this vandalism is nothing compared to the miracle God has worked in your heart tonight. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, could you show such grace to someone who had come to destroy something precious to you?" Father Murphy's response taught me more about true Christianity in that moment than years of theological study could have accomplished. This was not the harsh, judgmental religion I had been taught to despise, but something beautiful and redemptive that saw potential for transformation even in the most unlikely circumstances. He helped me to my feet, supporting my unsteady legs, as circulation returned after hours of kneeling on the cold stone. Together we examined the spray paint damage, which he assured me could be cleaned off with the right solvents. The hammer had left no permanent marks on the statue itself, and he pointed out that what I had intended as an act of destruction had been prevented by what could only be described as divine intervention. God has a sense of timing, Father Murphy observed with a gentle chuckle. He stopped you before any real damage could be done, and he sent me here early this morning instead of my usual evening visit. I think he has plans for you, young man, plans that go far beyond what you attempted here tonight. As the sun rose fully above the Dublin skyline, I found myself beginning the most important conversation of my life with a Catholic priest I had met in the most impossible circumstances. The brotherhood in faith that had brought me to this place was nothing compared to the true brotherhood I was about to discover in Christ. The weeks following my encounter at the shrine were the most difficult and transformative of my entire life. Father Murphy invited me to return the following evening to begin what he called my journey of discovery, and I found myself counting the hours until I could sit with him again in the small study behind the church rectory. That tiny room, with its walls lined with theological books and its single window overlooking the shrine grounds, became my sanctuary during those early days of spiritual upheaval. Confessing everything to Father Murphy that first morning had been like opening an infected wound that needed to drain completely before healing could begin. But as the days passed, I realized that confession was only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated process. 28 years of deeply ingrained beliefs don't simply disappear overnight, even after a supernatural encounter. My mind was like a battlefield where my new faith in Christ warred constantly with the Islamic theology that had shaped every aspect of my worldview since childhood. Father Murphy proved to be exactly the spiritual guide I needed during this tumultuous period. Rather than rushing me toward baptism or pressuring me to make dramatic public declarations, he patiently walked alongside me as I wrestled with the most fundamental questions of existence. Our evening sessions usually lasted 2 or 3 hours, during which he would answer my endless questions about Christian doctrine with the kind of scholarly precision that comes from decades of theological study combined with genuine pastoral care. The Bible became my obsession during those weeks. Father Murphy had given me a copy during our second meeting, and I devoured it with the same intensity I had once brought to radical Islamic literature. But where those online forums had fed my anger and resentment, every page of scripture seemed to speak directly to the hunger in my soul. The Gospels in particular felt like they had been written specifically for me. Each parable and teaching of Jesus addressing doubts and fears I had carried for years. Reading about Christ's interaction with tax collectors, prostitutes, and other social outcasts gave me hope that there might be room in his kingdom, even for a former radical who had come within seconds of vandalizing a shrine. The story of Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus resonated so powerfully that I read it dozens of times, marveling at how God could transform even the most zealous persecutor into his most devoted servant. But my spiritual transformation came at a tremendous personal cost that I hadn't fully anticipated. Ahmed and Omar had initially been concerned about my disappearance from their activism, calling and texting repeatedly during the first few days after the incident. When I finally answered Ahmed's calls and tried to explain what had happened to me, his reaction was everything I had feared, and worse. The conversation took place over coffee at our usual meeting spot near the university, and I could see the confusion and growing horror
in Ahmed's eyes as I described my encounter with Christ. He listened in stunned silence as I told him about the supernatural light, about Father Murphy's kindness, about my growing certainty that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. When I finished speaking, Ahmed stared at me for a long moment before asking if I had suffered some kind of mental
breakdown. Omar's reaction was even more violent. When Ahmed brought him to our next meeting and I repeated my testimony, Omar accused me of being a traitor to our cause, our people, and our faith. The brotherhood we had built over months of shared anger and planning disintegrated in a matter of minutes. They left that coffee shop convinced that I had either lost my mind or been somehow brainwashed by Christian missionaries, and I never saw either of them again. The real test came when I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents. I had been avoiding their house for weeks, making excuses about being busy with studies whenever they called. But I knew I couldn't hide my transformation forever, especially as my commitment to Christ grew stronger each day. The conversation I had been dreading took place on a cold December evening in our small living room, with my mother serving tea and my father reading his newspaper in his favorite chair. When I told them I had become a Christian, my mother's teacup fell from her hands and shattered on the hardwood floor. My father set down his newspaper slowly, his face cycling through disbelief, disappointment, and finally a cold anger I had never seen before. The silence that followed was more devastating than any shouting could have been. In that moment, I realized I was losing not just my family's approval, but possibly my family itself. My mother wept as she cleaned up the broken porcelain, her tears mixing with the spilled tea as she asked me how we had failed as parents. My father's response was more measured, but ultimately more painful. He explained calmly that if I persisted in this apostasy, I would no longer be welcome in their home. The son they had raised, he said, was dead to them. The stranger sitting in their living room claiming to follow Jesus was not their child. Look inside your own heart right now and imagine losing everything familiar for the sake of truth. That's exactly what I faced during those dark weeks in December. My former friends viewed me as a traitor, my family saw me as a spiritual corpse, and the broader Muslim community that learned of my conversion treated me like a dangerous contagion that might spread to others if not properly contained. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if the supernatural encounter at the shrine had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and guilt. The loneliness was crushing at times, especially when I walked past the mosque where I had prayed for years and knew I was no longer welcome there. Every familiar landmark in my neighborhood became a reminder of the life I had left behind. But Father Murphy remained a constant source of encouragement during those difficult weeks. He had seen other converts struggle with similar family rejection, and he helped me understand that the cost of following Christ had always been high for those who took his call seriously. Our evening Bible studies became lifelines during that period, anchoring me to the truth I had encountered when every emotion screamed that I should abandon this new path and return to the familiar safety of my old beliefs. The breakthrough came during a particularly intense study session in late December when Father Murphy asked if I was ready to take the next step in my journey. Baptism, he explained, would be my public declaration of faith in Christ, my symbolic death to the old life and resurrection into the new. As I considered his question, I realized that despite all the losses and difficulties, I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The peace that had flooded my heart during that supernatural encounter at the shrine remained with me still, a constant reminder that I was exactly where God wanted me to be. The same divine presence that had stopped my hammer and revealed Christ's love was sustaining me through every trial and preparing me for whatever came next. My baptism took place on a crisp January morning at the same church that overlooked the shrine where my life had been transformed just 2 months earlier. Father Murphy had suggested we wait until I felt completely ready, and after weeks of prayer and study, I knew beyond any doubt that this was the step God was calling me to take. The symbolism wasn't lost on me that I would be baptized within sight of the Virgin Mary statue I had once tried to destroy. The ceremony itself was small and intimate, attended only by Father Murphy, two elderly parishioners who had become like grandparents to me during my conversion journey, and surprisingly, my younger sister Amira. She had reached out to me despite our parents' prohibition, unable to completely sever the bond we had shared since childhood. Though she couldn't understand my decision, she loved me enough to witness this most important moment of my spiritual life. As I descended into the baptismal pool, Father Murphy spoke the ancient words that have marked the beginning of countless Christian journeys. Farhan, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The water closed over my head for what felt like an eternity, and when I emerged, gasping and dripping, I felt as though I was breathing for the first time in my life. The old Farhan, the angry activist, who had lived for hatred and destruction, died in those waters. The man who rose up was someone entirely new. That baptism marked not just a spiritual transformation, but the beginning of my practical ministry. Father Murphy had been observing my genuine desire to serve Christ, and he proposed something that shocked even me. Would I consider working at the very shrine I had tried to vandalize? The irony was so perfect, so clearly orchestrated by divine providence, that I could only marvel at God's sense of humor and justice. Today, nearly 2 years later, I wake up each morning and walk to work at the Rath Farnham Shrine, where my old life ended and my new one began. I serve as the groundskeeper and unofficial guardian of the place, tending the gardens, maintaining the prayer areas, and most importantly, sharing my testimony with the countless visitors who come seeking spiritual answers. The Virgin Mary statue stands exactly as it did that November night, unmarked by my intended violence, a daily reminder of God's protective grace. My work at the shrine has become far more than just a job. It's a living testimony to the transforming power of Christ's love. Every morning, I clean the spray paint residue that Ahmed left behind, a task I've turned into a form of prayer and penance. Every afternoon, I tend the flower beds that surround the statue, creating beauty where I once intended to sow destruction. Every evening, I lock the gates and offer a prayer of gratitude for the miracle that saved my soul. The visitors who come to the shrine represent every imaginable background and faith tradition. There are devout Catholics who have been making pilgrimages here for decades, curious tourists drawn by the peaceful atmosphere, and surprisingly often, Muslims struggling with their own questions about faith and identity. When they ask about my story, as many do when they notice my obvious Middle Eastern heritage working at a Catholic shrine, I tell them exactly what happened to me on that November night. Some listeners are skeptical, dismissing my testimony as the delusion of a mentally unstable young man. Others are intrigued but cautious, unwilling to consider that their own religious certainties might be incomplete. But occasionally, someone hears my story with the same hunger for truth that had driven my own spiritual search, and I have the incredible privilege of watching God work in their heart, just as He worked in mine. One of the most meaningful encounters occurred last spring when a young Muslim woman named Zara approached me after overhearing me share my testimony with a group of Catholic pilgrims. She had been struggling with her own doubts about Islam, particularly regarding the treatment of women in certain interpretations of the faith. My story gave her permission to explore questions she had been afraid to ask, and over several months of conversation and study, she too encountered Christ's transforming love. Watching Zara's own journey to faith reminded me that God can use even the most unlikely instruments to accomplish His purposes. The same passion that had once driven me to radical activism now fuels my desire to share the gospel with anyone who will listen. The same intensity that had made me dangerous as a Muslim extremist now makes me effective as a Christian witness. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you're truly open to having your entire worldview transformed by an encounter with divine truth. That's exactly what Christ offers to every person who approaches Him with genuine sincerity, regardless of their background or previous beliefs. The same Jesus who revealed Himself to me in supernatural light is actively seeking relationship with you right now. Perhaps the most healing development in my new life has been the gradual restoration of my relationship with my family. My parents still struggle to understand my conversion, and our interactions remain strained at times. But they can see the peace in my eyes, the joy that radiates from my life despite the challenges I've faced. My mother recently admitted that she had never seen me as genuinely happy as I am now. And while she doesn't share my faith, she's grateful for the transformation she witnesses in my character. Even Ahmed has reached out to me recently, curious about the dramatic changes in my life that mutual friends have reported. Our coffee meeting was awkward and tentative, but I was able to share my testimony with the same friend who had fled in terror from the shrine that night. He hasn't made any commitment to explore Christianity himself, but he admitted that whatever happened to me was clearly real and profoundly life-changing. The Virgin Mary statue that stands at the center of the shrine has become far more than just a religious monument to me. She represents the maternal love of God that pursued me even when I was His enemy, the divine mercy that protected me from my own destructive intentions, and the incredible truth that no one is beyond the reach of Christ's redemptive grace. That supernatural light didn't just illuminate the shrine grounds on November 6th. It illuminated the truth about who Jesus really is and what He offers to every human heart that will receive Him. The same Christ who stopped my hammer and changed my heart is calling to you right now, offering the same transformation that turned a radical Muslim activist into a devoted Christian witness. Will you let Him transform your life the way He transformed mine that November night, when divine intervention saved both a statue and a soul? The choice is yours, but I can promise you this: if you open your heart to Jesus Christ, He will reveal Himself to you in ways that will change everything about how you see God, faith, and your purpose in this world.